The moment she measured my son's therapy equipment with that smug smile on her face, something inside me shattered. A familiar fault line cracking open. How could anyone look at a child struggling to walk and see only a property value reduction? My hands trembled. Not from fear, but from that primal rage only a mother knows, when the thing you've created from your own flesh is threatened. What would happen when they discovered that the woman they'd been threatening for weeks could end their entire board with a single phone call? The thought pulsed behind my eyes, dangerous and tempting. Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA stories. The morning light filtered through our kitchen windows, casting golden patterns across the counter where I sat reviewing my patient files. 6-year-old Ethan's physical therapy schedule was pinned to the refrigerator with colorful magnets, little achievements marked with stars that represented mountains he had climbed in his young life. Each star a battle won against the body that betrayed him, each accomplishment etched into my heart with both pride and sorrow. I traced my finger across the paper, feeling the indentations of the pen marks. Tuesday, gait training. Thursday, strength exercises. Saturday, balance work. My child's life measured out in therapeutic increments. The weight of this calendar pressed against my chest, some days heavier than others. We had purchased our home in Oakwood Estates 8 months ago primarily for the backyard. The space was perfect, level ground, adequate shade from mature oak trees, and enough room for the specialized therapy equipment Ethan needed. The previous owners had maintained a meticulous garden, but functionality had to prevail over aesthetics in our case. Every choice we made now orbited around Ethan's needs, a fact that had reshaped our existence so gradually I sometimes forgot there was ever another way to live. "Mommy, can we go outside?" Ethan appeared at the doorway, his small hands gripping his walking aids. The determination in his eyes always made my chest ache with a mixture of pride and sorrow. So much was contained in such a fragile vessel. Those eyes, my eyes, looking back at me with a resolve that sometimes made me feel like the child. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's get some fresh air while I finish my coffee." My coffee had grown cold, forgotten during my review of case files. The lives of other children spilled across our breakfast table, MRI results, treatment protocols, consultation notes. Sometimes the weight of responsibility for all these young lives threatened to pull me under, a quiet undertow beneath my professional composure. Our morning ritual. Me watching him navigate the specialized balance beams and suspension rings we'd installed after 3 months of careful HOA paperwork submission, architect consultations, and what I believed was proper approval. The equipment wasn't garish. We'd specifically chosen natural wood elements and earthy tones that blended with the landscape. It looked more like an artistic outdoor installation than medical equipment. I'd been meticulous, knowing how these suburban fiefdoms operated, their invisible boundaries and unspoken hierarchies. I watched Ethan's hands grip the wooden bars, his knuckles whitening with effort. Each movement a negotiation between will and ability. My own hands clenched in unconscious mimicry, as if I could somehow transfer my strength to him through sheer force of wanting. The morning air carried the scent of dew-dampened grass and the nearby flowering dogwoods. These moments, these ordinary, extraordinary moments, made the crushing schedule of hospital administration and life-or-death decisions bearable. My pager buzzed. The hospital, always the hospital, a persistent reminder that others needed me too. I glanced at it while keeping one eye on Ethan, who was making his way across the modified monkey bars that had been designed to strengthen his upper body while providing proper support for his condition. The message was from the NICU, premature twins struggling to maintain body temperature. My mind immediately split in two, the mother watching her son and the doctor calculating interventions. I hadn't mentioned my position at Westlake Medical Center to many neighbors. Not out of secrecy, but because conversations changed when people discovered I was chief of pediatric medicine. Their children's sniffles suddenly became consultations in grocery store aisles. Their respect often morphed into something performative rather than genuine. The careful distance collapsed, replaced by either excessive deference or the particular entitlement people feel toward doctors, as if my education and expertise were communal property to be accessed between selecting produce and checking expiration dates on milk cartons. In this neighborhood, I was just Dr. Sarah Mitchell, mother to Ethan, wife to James, the woman who grew herbs in window boxes and occasionally forgot to bring in the mail. This separation of identities was a fragile membrane I maintained for my own sanity. The chief physician couldn't exist in the same space as the worried mother. They were matter and antimatter, threatening annihilation if they touched. "Look, Mom, I did it." Ethan's voice pulled me back, his face flushed with triumph as he completed a circuit on the equipment that just last week had defeated him. His smile, rare and precious, exposed the gap where his front tooth had recently vacated, a normal childhood milestone in a life where normalcy was a luxury. "That's amazing, buddy. You're getting so strong." I clapped, genuine joy bubbling up through the layers of fatigue and worry. These victories sustained us both. Ethan's laughter pulled me from my thoughts as he successfully navigated a section of equipment he'd been struggling with for weeks. My heart swelled. Every inch of progress was a victory. The therapeutic value of having this equipment available at home rather than only during structured hospital visits was immeasurable, both physically and psychologically. I knew this not just as his mother, but as a physician who had seen countless children plateau in sterile hospital environments, only to thrive when therapy became integrated into their daily lives, normalized and demedicalized. I took a sip of my forgotten coffee, grimacing at its coldness, and felt the weight of the pager on my hip, that constant tether to responsibility. The twins would need my attention soon. The department budget meeting couldn't be postponed again. Dr. Kaplan's research proposal needed review. The membrane between my worlds was growing thin. Little did I know that someone was watching us from behind drawn curtains across the street, measuring tape and HOA rulebook in hand, preparing to collapse those worlds entirely. The first notice came on a Tuesday. A white envelope with the Oakwood Estates letterhead tucked into our door frame. I opened it while juggling groceries, expecting it to be notification of the upcoming community picnic. The paper sliced my finger, a thin line of crimson appearing like a warning. Notice of violation, unauthorized playground equipment installation. Reference HOA Covenant Section 13.4. My hands trembled slightly as I read through the document claiming we had installed recreational playground equipment without proper approval. A fine of $150 was assessed, with daily penalties of $50 until removal. Removal, the word stabbed through me. Blood from my paper cut smeared the corner of the notice, a small crimson flag. I stood in the entryway, groceries heavy in my arms, a strange buzzing in my ears like the prelude to a migraine. The carefully maintained separation between my worlds began to blur. I immediately called the number listed for Patricia Winters, HOA president. The conversation replays in my mind during sleepless nights, her voice dripping with rehearsed authority, the same tone I used with first-year residents who had overstepped their boundaries. The recognition of this similarity made my skin prickle with unease. "Mrs. Mitchell, our covenants clearly state that recreational structures require approval." "It's Dr. Mitchell, actually, and this isn't recreational, it's therapeutic equipment for my son who has a medical condition." My voice remained measured, professional, the same tone I used when explaining difficult diagnoses to worried parents. The doctor's voice, a shield against the mother's panic rising in my chest. "Whatever you call it, it looks like playground equipment, which is prohibited in front-facing yards." "It's in our backyard, Mrs. Winters." My free hand pressed against the cool countertop, anchoring me as I felt the first flutters of that dangerous maternal rage. "Which is visible from the corner street. Section 13.4 covers visibility from any public space." I submitted all the proper documentation before installation. I have the approval forms. The forms I had spent hours completing, attaching medical documentation, architectural renderings, materials specifications. Hours stolen from sleep, from Ethan, from patients. The careful work of a mother who knew systems had to be navigated precisely. A pause, the sound of papers shuffling. I could picture her manicured fingers rifling through files, looking for ammunition. That approval was for landscape architecture features, not playground equipment. My fingers pressed white against the countertop, the pain grounding me in reality when I wanted to dissolve into pure, incandescent fury. Because it's therapeutic equipment designed to blend with the landscape, I was transparent in my submission. Well, the board has determined it constitutes playground equipment, Dr. Mitchell. You have 14 days to remove it or appeal at the next board meeting. The conversation ended with my promise to bring medical documentation to the next meeting. I hung up, my chest constricted with anxiety and indignation. The grocery bags still sat unpacked, ice cream melting into a puddle that seemed like a metaphor for my carefully constructed life. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed. "Is something wrong, Mommy?" I forced a smile. "Nothing we can't handle, sweetie." The lie bitter on my tongue. How many times had I told him this? After diagnoses, after falls, after other children stared too long or asked too loudly what was wrong with him. Nothing we can't handle, the anthem of parents facing the impossible. That night, I pulled out all the documentation, the approval forms, Ethan's medical records, the therapeutic equipment specifications, the property surveys. Everything was in order. We had followed every rule. As I organized the papers, James placed a cup of tea beside me, his hand lingering on my shoulder. The weight of his touch both comforting and somehow adding to the burden. Another person depending on my strength. "Maybe I should go to the meeting," he offered. "Sometimes these people just need a man's voice too." "No," the word came out sharper than intended, a blade between us. "I need to handle this myself." His hand withdrew, leaving a cold spot where warmth had been. The hurt in his eyes added another layer to my guilt. He was trying to help, to share the load. But this was my domain, the intricate navigation of medical systems, of bureaucracy, the place where my expertise lived. What I didn't say, I needed to understand what kind of people would target a child's medical equipment, what kind of community we had really moved into, what kind of battle I was preparing to fight, and I needed to keep James, sweet, conflict-averse James, from seeing the cold calculation of which I was capable when necessary. My tea grew cold beside me, forgotten like the morning's coffee. Another day of nourishment postponed in favor of fighting invisible enemies. My stomach growled, reminding me of the unpacked groceries, the unmade dinner, the endless tasks that didn't pause for bureaucratic warfare. Later, lying in bed with sleep evading me, I stared at the ceiling and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was happening. This wasn't just about equipment. It was about Ethan's right to exist in this space without hiding his needs. About whether our family belonged in a community that valued conformity over compassion. About the creeping suspicion that Patricia Winter's issue wasn't with wooden bars in a backyard, but with the visible evidence of disability disrupting her manicured vision of perfection. The thought made my chest tighten until breathing became a conscious effort. Beside me, James slept soundly, his breathing deep and regular. Even in sleep, a gulf stretched between us, my racing thoughts keeping me on a separate shore from his peaceful slumber. The membrane between my worlds had been punctured. Dr. Mitchell, who handled life-or-death situations with calm authority, was being summoned to defend Sarah, the mother who just wanted her son to have a fair chance. The harassment escalated with breathtaking efficiency. A second notice appeared 3 days later, claiming our herb garden constituted agricultural use of residential property. A third notice followed for improper storage of Ethan's adaptive bicycle on our covered porch. Each envelope ignited a fresh wave of indignation, each accusation more absurd than the last. The papers accumulated on my desk, a growing monument to pettiness. Then Patricia Winters began her daily drive-bys. I'd see her silver Mercedes cruise slowly past our home, sometimes stopping while she took photos with her phone. Once, I caught her actually standing at the edge of our property with a measuring tape, extending it toward Ethan's equipment while he was using it. The sight struck me physically, a visceral violation that made bile rise in my throat. My child, being measured and documented like a specimen, his therapeutic struggle turned into evidence against us. My blood boiled beneath my skin. Rage pulsed behind my eyes, threatening to blind me. The same white-hot fury I had felt when a junior doctor had once suggested Ethan's condition was just developmental delays that he would grow out of. The rage that made colleagues step back, sensing something dangerous and primal beneath my professional demeanor. I approached her, maintaining a calm I didn't feel. Each step toward her required conscious control, my body wanting to run, to confront, to protect. "Can I help you with something, Mrs. Winters?" She startled, then recovered with practiced poise, smoothing her immaculate bob. Not a hair out of place, not a wrinkle in her linen dress. The kind of perfection that requires constant vigilance and fear of imperfection. Just confirming measurements for the violation report. While my son is using his medical equipment. My voice emerged steady, belying the tremor in my hands that I concealed by pressing them against my thighs. "Rules apply to everyone, Dr. Mitchell." She pronounced my title with a subtle mockery, the way some patients do when they disagree with a female physician's assessment. "The board doesn't make exceptions based on sob stories." Sob stories? My son's medical journey reduced to a sob story. Years of surgeries, of therapies, of nights spent in hospital rooms, of celebrating milestones that come easily to other children, all collapsed into two dismissive words. Something dark and protective unfurled inside me. A mama bear awakening. The doctor receding, the mother advancing. "I think you should leave our property now." The words escaped through clenched teeth, each one measured and precise. She smiled, all bleached veneer. "Public easement, actually. I know exactly where your property line ends." Her eyes flicked to Ethan, still working on his equipment, his face furrowed in concentration. Something in her expression, pity, disgust, fascination, made my skin crawl. As she walked away, I noticed her glance at other homes on our street. Homes with basketball hoops, elaborate treehouses, one with an actual putting green. None had violation notices taped to their doors. The selective enforcement was so blatant it bordered on parody. I stood rooted to the spot, watching her retreat to her pristine house across the street. The taste of copper filled my mouth. I had bitten my cheek without realizing it. Pain radiated from my jaw where I had clenched it too tightly, my body holding the rage my words could not express. That evening, I began documenting everything, photographing other violations throughout the neighborhood that went unenforced, recording times of Patricia's drive-bys, saving all communications. I created a spreadsheet, methodical in my documentation, as if this were a complex medical case requiring careful observation. In some ways, it was. A diagnosis of malignant entitlement, perhaps, terminal pettiness. I also started researching the board members themselves, diving into public records, social media profiles, property tax information. The same investigative thoroughness I applied to difficult cases, I now turned toward these suburban tyrants. Patricia Winters, I discovered, had only lived in the neighborhood for 18 months, but had quickly ascended to HOA presidency after the previous president relocated. Her Facebook page revealed a carefully curated life, charity galas, tennis tournaments, wine tastings. Her husband was a developer with business before the city council. Their perfectly filtered existence a stark contrast to our messy, medical equipment-filled reality. More concerning were the patterns I began to notice in the violation enforcement. Young families and elderly residents received the bulk of citations. Properties owned by business associates of board members seemed immune to scrutiny. A pattern emerged, one that raised not just personal indignation but professional concern. This wasn't random harassment, it was systematic intimidation. "You know you don't have to fight this alone," James said one night as I pored over HOA financial records I'd requested. He placed his hands on my shoulders, kneading the knots that had formed there. "We could hire an attorney." I shook my head, not looking up from the documents where I was highlighting suspicious expenditures. "Not yet. I want to understand what we're dealing with first." What I didn't tell him, I had already consulted with Dr. Reena Sharma, head of our hospital's legal department. I had begun collecting evidence of discriminatory enforcement under the Fair Housing Act. I was building a case not just for our situation, but for everyone being targeted. The physician in me had diagnosed the disease and was preparing the treatment plan, aggressive intervention required. James' hands paused on my shoulders. "Sarah, you're working yourself into the ground, between the hospital, Ethan's care, and now this." I finally looked up, seeing the concern in his eyes. The same look he had given me during my pregnancy with Ethan, when complications arose and I refused to reduce my hospital hours. The look that said, "I love you, but I don't understand you." "I can handle it." The words emerged automatically, my standard response to any suggestion that I might be taking on too much. The mantra of the overextended, of the perpetually responsible. Of women who know that showing vulnerability means risking not being taken seriously. That night, I dreamed of Ethan trying to climb his equipment while it disappeared beneath him, wooden bars turning to smoke in his hands as Patricia Winters laughed from beyond a fence that grew higher with each second. I woke gasping, sheets twisted around me, James still sleeping peacefully beside me. The clock read 3:17 a.m., the witching hour of anxious mothers everywhere. I slipped from bed and went to Ethan's room, standing in the doorway watching his chest rise and fall in the blue-tinged darkness. His therapy equipment visible through the window, illuminated by moonlight, a shadow play of support structures that had become the center of this absurd battle. My son's opportunities for independence reduced to a property value calculation. Something crystallized in me there in the darkness, a resolve that went beyond professional determination or maternal protectiveness. This was about justice now, about power and its abuses, about the kind of world I wanted Ethan to inherit, one where difference wasn't hidden away to maintain appearances. I returned to bed but didn't sleep. Instead, I lay awake formulating a strategy with the same methodical precision I would apply to a difficult surgical case. Identifying the problem, assessing resources, planning intervention, anticipating complications. Patricia Winters had no idea what she had awakened. The breaking point came on a rain-soaked Thursday. Water dripped from my surgical cap as I left the hospital, the sky having opened during an emergency procedure that had kept me 6 hours past my scheduled shift. A 7-year-old with a ruptured appendix, touch and go for a while, but stable now. Relief mingled with fatigue in every muscle of my body. All I wanted was to hold Ethan, to sink into the mundane comfort of home. Instead, I arrived to find Ethan in tears and James furious. The rain had plastered Ethan's hair to his forehead, his eyes red-rimmed and swollen. James paced the living room, hands opening and closing as if searching for something to grasp. "What happened?" I asked, dread solidifying in my stomach before either could answer. While we were gone, HOA inspectors had entered our backyard and placed large orange violation stickers directly on Ethan's therapy equipment, declaring it unapproved and scheduled for removal. The stickers had damaged the specialized coating on the equipment, coating that protected my son's sensitive skin while providing necessary grip for his therapy. "They came into our yard?" My voice sounded distant to my own ears, as if coming from the other end of a tunnel. The violation hung in the air, not just of property, but of sanctuary, of the safe space we had created for our child. James nodded, said they had the right to inspect violations on the property. His voice trembled with suppressed rage, so unusual for my gentle husband. "I found them when I brought Ethan home from school. They were still here, placing the stickers." Ethan's small body shook with sobs. "They said my special bars are ugly, Mommy. They said they make the neighborhood look bad." Something inside me, some final thread of professional restraint, snapped clean through. A sound escaped me, something between a laugh and a growl. My bag dropped to the floor, papers spilling across the entryway, patient charts, research documents, hospital memos. Dr. Mitchell's world scattered across the floor while Sarah the mother took complete control. "They said that to you?" I knelt before Ethan, taking his small face in my hands. His tears wet my fingers, his breath hitching with lingering sobs. He nodded. "The lady with the yellow hair said I should go to the hospital for therapy instead of making everyone look at my equipment." The lady with yellow hair, Patricia Winters, speaking to my child about his medical needs, suggesting he hide his disability to preserve aesthetic appeal. A calm descended over me, the dangerous calm I felt before making a critical incision, when there was no room for emotion, only precision. "You listen to me, Ethan. There is nothing ugly about your equipment. There is nothing ugly about you or the ways you need to move in the world. The only ugly thing here is grown-ups who have forgotten what matters." I kissed his forehead and stood, suddenly aware that I was still in my scrubs, still smelling of hospital antiseptic, my hair damp with rain and sweat. "James, can you get Ethan ready for dinner? I need to make a call." I stepped onto the back porch, rain still falling in silver sheets, and called Patricia Winters directly. When she answered, I spoke with a coldness I typically reserved for incompetent residents endangering patients. You will never enter my property without permission again. You will never speak to my child again. And you will replace the equipment your vandalism damaged, or I will pursue every legal remedy available to me. My voice emerged without inflection, each word a precise surgical instrument. Her laugh floated through the phone, high and artificial. Are you threatening me, Dr. Mitchell? The board has authority to inspect violations. Perhaps if you'd spent less time at the hospital and more time understanding the covenants you signed. I cut her off. The next communication you receive from me will be at the board meeting. I strongly suggest you consult with legal counsel before then. I hung up and stood in the rain, letting it wash over me. Letting it cool the burning rage that threatened to consume every rational thought. The membrane between my worlds had not just been punctured, it had been obliterated. There was no more separation, no more compartmentalization. The physician's precision would now serve the mother's fury. Inside, I held my crying son, promising him that no one would take away his equipment. That night, after he was asleep, I made phone calls to colleagues, to contacts at the American Academy of Pediatrics, to former patients' families who were disability rights attorneys. My network, built over years of professional service, now mobilized for personal battle. I worked until dawn, assembling documentation, preparing presentations, outlining legal arguments. The rain continued through the night, a percussion accompaniment to my gathering storm. When James brought me coffee as the sun rose, his eyes widened at the stacks of materials surrounding me. Sarah, what is all this? I looked up, aware of how I must appear, uncombed hair, yesterday's scrubs, eyes red from strain. This is what happens when they mess with the wrong mother. The HOA had chosen the wrong mother to target. They had chosen a woman who spent her days fighting for children against diseases that didn't care about property values, who had learned to navigate medical bureaucracies and insurance labyrinths, who had sat across from parents facing impossible choices and helped them find a way forward. Patricia Winters thought she was dealing with just another harried, overextended mother. She was about to discover her mistake. The monthly HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a bland beige room with uncomfortable folding chairs and fluorescent lighting that buzzed overhead like angry insects. I arrived early, setting up my materials methodically at a small side table. Each folder placed precisely, each document arranged for maximum efficiency. The ritual calmed me, centered me in the familiar territory of preparation. Patricia sat at the front with 4 other board members, all looking like variations on the same country club theme: pastels and permanents, firm handshakes and predatory smiles. Patricia's eyes widened slightly when she saw the size of my presentation folder, but she quickly regained her composure, leaning to whisper something to the man beside her. Their shared laugh sent a ripple of awareness down my spine, the same feeling I get when entering a surgical theater. The knowledge that everything is about to change. I wore my hospital ID badge clipped to my blazer, a calculated choice. Not Dr. Mitchell the mother tonight, but Dr. Mitchell the chief of pediatric medicine. The weight of the badge against my chest was armor, the accumulated authority of years of training and expertise. The room gradually filled. I recognized many faces, neighbors who had received their own questionable violations. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow who'd been cited for decorative inconsistency when she installed a ramp for her wheelchair. The Singh family, fighting over their religious holiday decorations, all victims of selective enforcement. James sat in the back with Ethan, who had insisted on coming despite my concerns. "I want to see you fix it, Mommy," he had said with a simplicity that brought tears to my eyes. His faith in me both buoyed and terrified me. At precisely 7:00 p.m., Patricia called the meeting to order, reviewing minutes and budget items before addressing violations. My case was listed last, clearly intended to be rushed through at the end when everyone was tired. A common tactic in hospital administration meetings: bury the controversial items at the end when resistance is weakened by fatigue. I didn't mind. I preferred having the final word. As the meeting progressed, I observed Patricia's performance, her practiced authority, her selective enforcement of speaking time, her subtle dismissals of certain concerns while elevating others. The political choreography was familiar from countless hospital board meetings. The difference was that there, I was fighting for patients. Here, I was fighting for my son. The stakes felt simultaneously smaller and infinitely larger. When Patricia finally announced, unapproved playground installation at 347 Oakwood Drive, I stood, medical documentation in hand. My heart pounded against my ribs, but my hands were steady, surgeon's hands, mother's hands, now warrior's hands. "Before I begin," I said, my voice steady, "I'd like to distribute copies of relevant medical information and legal precedent regarding the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation provisions." Patricia's smile tightened. "That won't be necessary. This is a simple covenant violation matter." "Actually," I continued as if she hadn't spoken, "it's a matter of federally protected rights for my disabled son, so these materials are quite relevant." I distributed folders to each board member. Several neighbors took copies as well. The rustle of papers filled the room, a sound like gathering wind before a storm. As you can see from the documentation, the equipment in question is prescribed medical therapy equipment for my son, who has a diagnosed neuromuscular condition. Under the Fair Housing Act, homeowners associations are required to make reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. As I spoke, I felt the room's energy shift. The technical language, the citation of federal statutes, I was moving the conversation from neighborhood politics to legal territory, from subjective aesthetics to objective rights. Patricia interrupted, her voice higher than before. "Dr. Mitchell, while we sympathize with your situation, rules are rules. The equipment violates our aesthetic guidelines." Interesting. I clicked open my laptop presentation, the screen illuminating my face from below. A theatrical touch, perhaps, but effective. Because I've documented 17 other structural additions throughout the neighborhood that also violate those same guidelines, yet have received no citations. Photos appeared on the screen: elaborate treehouses, basketball courts, even a putting green. I've also noted that violations seem to be disproportionately issued to families with children and elderly residents, which constitutes discriminatory enforcement. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Patricia's face flushed, 2 spots of color appearing high on her cheekbones. Her fingers tapped against the table, a rhythm of anxiety I recognized from residents facing difficult questions during rounds. "Furthermore," I continued, clicking to the next slide, "I've discovered something particularly concerning." The screen showed a property on Willow Lane. This is a property on Willow Lane belonging to Barbara Reynolds. As you can see, it has nearly identical therapeutic equipment installed in the backyard. This installation was approved by this board 3 months ago. The room went silent. The kind of silence that falls in an operating room when an unexpected complication is discovered. What makes this interesting is that Barbara Reynolds is your sister-in-law, Mrs. Winters. The exact same equipment that is a violation on my property was approved on a family member's property. Patricia's face drained of color, the flush replaced by a waxy pallor. That's different. Their situation, I cut in, is identical to mine, except for one key difference. Their child is your niece. My documentation shows at least 7 instances where board members' families received special exemptions while similar requests from other residents were denied. I allowed the implications to settle across the room before continuing, the weight of the evidence hanging in the air, almost tangible. Now, I've been very patient. I've followed every proper channel, but I believe it's time I properly introduce myself. I stood straighter, letting the professional authority I typically kept separate from my home life emerge fully. For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Chief of Pediatric Medicine at Westlake Medical Center and sitting board member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Special Needs Council. The shift in the room was palpable. Several board members straightened in their chairs, suddenly alert. The whispers increased, a tide of recognition washing through the assembled neighbors. The equipment you've been so eager to remove is not only medically necessary for my son's development, but is equipment I personally helped design for children with his condition. Equipment now used in 37 pediatric rehabilitation centers across the country. I paused, letting the weight of my credentials sink in. In the back of the room, Ethan sat straighter in his chair, pride evident in his posture. This was for him, not just the equipment, but the example. Showing him how to stand up against injustice, how to use privilege and position to fight not just for yourself, but for others. I placed a thick legal document on the table. This is a formal complaint documenting violations of the Fair Housing Act, with evidence of discriminatory enforcement patterns and failure to provide reasonable accommodation for a disability. I've prepared copies for each board member, as well as for the County Housing Authority, the State Attorney General's Office, and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Patricia's face had gone from pale to ashen. There's no need to escalate this to. I've already escalated it, I interrupted calmly. This morning, in fact, but I believe in giving people the opportunity to correct their mistakes, which is why I'm here offering a solution rather than proceeding directly to litigation. I handed out another document. This is a proposed revision to the HOA's reasonable accommodation process, drafted with the assistance of the disability rights attorneys who successfully litigated similar cases in Westfield and Granbury. It would bring your procedures into compliance with federal law and establish clear, non-discriminatory guidelines for all residents. The vice president of the board, a silver-haired man who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately, Patricia." His voice carried a warning, the same tone I use when a resident is about to make a critical error. Patricia seemed frozen, staring at the documents before her. I could almost see the calculations behind her eyes, the reputational damage, the legal costs, the personal exposure for board members who had knowingly violated federal law. The perfect life she had curated crumbling around her in real time. "One more thing," I added, pulling out a final folder. "During my research, I noticed some concerning irregularities in the HOA financial records. I didn't elaborate further. I didn't need to. The threat hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Financial impropriety was the nuclear option, the mutually assured destruction I hoped not to deploy but had prepared nonetheless." Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman with the wheelchair ramp, broke the silence with a slow, deliberate clap that others gradually joined. The sound swelled, filling the beige room with something unexpected: solidarity. Community. The thing Patricia had claimed to protect while systematically destroying. Patricia's composure finally cracked. "This meeting is adjourned for the board to consult with our attorney," she announced, voice trembling slightly. She gathered her papers with shaking hands, dropping several in her haste. As the board members hurried into a side room, neighbors surrounded me, sharing their own stories of harassment and selective enforcement. We exchanged contact information, forming an impromptu coalition. For the first time since moving in, I felt part of a community, not the manicured facade Patricia had cultivated, but something real and supportive. Ethan made his way to me through the crowd, his walking aids clicking against the linoleum floor. He beamed up at me, his eyes shining. "You fixed it, Mommy." I knelt down to his level, taking his small hands in mine. "We're working on it, buddy. Sometimes fixing broken things takes time." "Like my legs?" he asked, with the devastating directness of children. My throat tightened. "Yes, like that. Some things we can fix completely, some things we learn to work with, but we never stop trying." When the board emerged 30 minutes later, Patricia was noticeably absent. The vice president approached me with a conciliatory smile. "Dr. Mitchell, the board would like to formally rescind all violations related to your son."